I would like to welcome everyone. I'm Fred Conrad, Director of the Michigan Program in Survey and Data Science. Welcome to today's seminar, which is sponsored really by two different groups. ISR's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Working Group on Educational Programs is hosting a seminar series on inclusive research. And I think today's seminar fits perfectly into that series. It also fits into our almost weekly methodology brown bag series, sponsored jointly by the Joint Program in Survey Methodology at the University of Maryland and the Michigan Program in Survey Methodology at the University of Michigan. So to not really squander our available time, I will cut this short to just say it's a great pleasure to welcome our speaker today, Dr. Frances Barlas. I'll just tell you a little bit about Dr. Barlas. She's a Senior Vice President and the lead knowledge panel methodologist for Ipsos. She has worked in survey and market research, in the survey and market research industries for 20 years. In her current role, she's charged with overseeing and advancing the statistical integrity and operational efficiency of KnowledgePanel, the largest probability-based panel in the US, and I believe the first, although Dr. Barlas can correct me, and as well as other Ipsos research assets. Her research interests in general focus on survey measurement and online survey data quality. Dr. Barlas holds a PhD in sociology from Temple University. Her talk today is entitled Representative Research, Assessing Diversity in Online Samples. So Dr. Barlas, the floor is yours.
All right, great. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining me today. I'm super excited to be here. I was really honored when Dr. Conrad extended the invitation to me. So I know we have a number of students in the audience, so I thought I'd just take a minute or two to talk a little bit about my background. I'm always fascinated to hear how people ended up in the survey research industry. It's not really a career that people aspire to as they're thinking about what they want to be when they grow up. So it's fun for me to hear how we all got to share this interest together. For me, it really started when I started my graduate studies in sociology. So I went into school thinking that I wanted to learn more about inequality and just the systemic nature of inequality in our society. And then I was surprised when I found that I really enjoyed statistics and the research methods classes that I was taking. So I really leaned into that throughout my studies and took as many courses as I could in statistics and research during my time at Temple. And then one of my professors, Dr. Eugene Erickson, worked at an economic consulting firm on the side while he was teaching. And so I worked for him as well. He worked as a testifying expert in surveys and sampling. And so that work really provided me a strong foundation in survey research. We always knew that the experts on the other side of whatever case we were working on would comb through our work with a fine-tooth comb. So everything we did really had to be rooted in the research and literature around survey research. So, you know, our justification for the scale choice that we had and all of that was really well documented and rooted in the literature. So it gave me that strong foundation, which I could then leverage throughout the rest of my career. After I finished my PhD, I got a job at ICF International in the DC area. And that's really a company that focuses on federal contracting. So I got to see how large scale federally funded surveys are fielded and designed, which was a whole different experience for me. A lot of the work I did there was focused on the military population, active duty military, and really looking at health related behaviors. And then I heard about an opportunity at GFK to work with KnowledgePanel, which, as Dr. Conrad mentioned, is the first and currently the largest probability-based online panel in the US. And that was really appealing to me because I really saw online surveys as the future of our industry. So I jumped at the opportunity to take that job. And then just a couple of years ago, the panel was acquired by Ipsos. So I've seen kind of a lot of different sides of the survey and market research industry throughout my career. I guess before I get started, I did want to mention, so over the 20 years of my career, I've been using the word Hispanic to talk about Hispanic or Latino people here in the US. And I've just recently been reading a little bit about the language that we use. And so I know now that Hispanic centers really the white Western European perspective, the colonizing perspective. So I'll be switching my language to Latino, but you may see me use them interchangeably as I'm working on making that change. So bear with me on that. So we saw in 2020 a broader awakening to the continued systemic racism throughout all aspects of our society. And we heard renewed calls for racial justice. So in the wake of the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, we saw widespread protests here in the US, and those protests spread to many countries throughout the world. And this really prompted many people to begin to question the role that we play and the work that we should be doing in dismantling white supremacy. And I think it raised a number of questions for the survey and market research industries. One of those questions we'll be diving into today, which is really around how well we do to ensure that our public opinion research or our survey research really captures the full set of diverse voices that make up the US. And I'll just give one example as to why this is important. I think there are many reasons why it's critical to make sure that we're really capturing all voices in our work. But survey research has played a key role in documenting the unfolding of the COVID-19 pandemic and the way it's affected our society. And we know that the pandemic has had differential impacts by race and ethnicity, with Black, Latinx, and Native Americans facing disproportionately high rates of infection, hospitalization, and death. And we've done a lot of work as well to unpack COVID vaccine hesitancy. So we're really trying to understand what are the barriers or what are the reasons why someone might be hesitant to get a COVID vaccine. And so I think that this kind of underscores how the work that we do, the stakes couldn't be higher to make sure we get this right. And we need to make sure we get this right, not just at the overall level, but for some of the key groups that are most affected by this pandemic. And we can think about how this research, how this thinking extends to other ways in which survey research is done, right? If we can really understand people's quality of life, we can potentially affect their longevity. So it really has important implications for how people are living and enjoying their life, and the way that we can go about making policy decisions to make important changes. So just to set the stage for what I'll be talking about, I do focus on online samples throughout this presentation, and we want to approach it from a couple different angles. So we'll look at the probability-based panel that I work on with KnowledgePanel as a whole, and then we'll look at some samples that are drawn from that panel, as well as some non-probability and opt-in sources, and looking at how well we do with representing both demographic variables as well as some other benchmarkable items, and then assess the impact of weighting. Is weighting helping us to reduce bias as it should be? So just to make sure we're all on the same page, there are two main types of online samples. So we've really seen a growth in the number of surveys that are run with an online mode in the last couple of years, the last maybe decade or more, as we've seen response rates to more traditional methodologies like the RDD telephone decline. And so there's really been a growth and explosion in online survey research. The two types, there's one, a probability-based or invitation-only panel. That's what KnowledgePanel is. So there, it's really trying to take the traditional sampling methodology and apply it to the online world. So people need to be randomly selected and invited to join the panel. It's not something that you can just volunteer for. The different panels have different modes of recruitment. For KnowledgePanel, it's an address-based sample. So we select a sample from the delivery sequence file and send mail to households to invite them to join the panel. And then most probability-based panels also will cover the offline population in some way. So for KnowledgePanel, we provide a tablet with a data plan for non-internet households, so households that tell us at the time of recruitment that they don't have the internet. Other panels will cover that population by doing a parallel telephone survey. And then the other main type is a non-probability or opt-in sample, what you may hear called an access panel. And those are samples where people can just volunteer to take surveys. They don't need to be invited. And so you'll see that those samples tend to skew towards a higher internet population. They tend to be more heavier internet users. It's people who are online. And usually these samples are kind of a mix of different vendors these days. It's rare that you'll see kind of a pure sample from one vendor. It's there's a router space where you're blending lots of different sample sources, and potentially also having intercept sample where there's maybe a pop-up and you're trying to grab someone's attention while they're surfing online. So these are two different ways of getting at how to administer surveys online. And then just to give a quick high-level overview of KnowledgePanel, since I will be talking about sample from that panel throughout the rest of this talk. The panel is right now about 60,000 members from 52,000 households. And as I mentioned, we do have an address-based sampling recruitment methodology. So we'll mail an invitation to households. They can respond in 3 different modes. They can respond by sending back an invitation to us, or they can go online to complete the recruitment survey, or they can call us to complete the recruitment survey. And then after that, all of our surveys are conducted wholly online. So both the online and the non-internet population that I mentioned are taking our surveys online. And then you can see that we have a bit of a non-response protocol to try to recruit and convert non-responders. So this is some results from a study that was published a little over 10 years ago at this point by Yeager and colleagues. It's what we would call a benchmarking study. And this is kind of a common way that people will use to assess the quality of online samples. This was really a landmark study, the first of its kind, that really looked at how well probability-based and opt-in samples are doing compared to a more traditional methodology. And so what they do is include a number of items in the questionnaire that are from things like the American Community Survey or the Current Population Survey that really allow you to judge the quality of your survey estimates against high quality benchmarkable gold standard items. And so this study ran parallel surveys on a telephone sample, RDD, KnowledgePanel, and then 7 different opt-in sample sources. And so you can see that the 2 probability-based samples have about the same amount of average divergence from benchmarks, so average absolute difference when we're comparing the survey estimate to the benchmark estimate, about 3 percentage points. And then the opt-in sample, what's important to see here is that the bias is higher. So all of them are higher than the 2 probability-based samples. And you also see quite a bit of divergence across the 7 different sources. So one provider had a 4.4% average difference, and the other, the largest, was up to 7 percentage points. So you see great variability in terms of how far off estimates are from benchmarks. And so that's a pretty common way of assessing the quality of these 2 different sample types, and something that you regularly see people updated just to make sure that we're still seeing probability-based samples having lower bias than opt-in samples. But what most of these studies do is they really just stop there at that overall level. There's been a lot less work that has really dug down into subgroup level to see if we're seeing the same amount of bias or different levels of bias among key subgroups of interest. So we did find one study that did dig a little deeper, a study by Pew from a couple of years ago. And they were comparing their American Trends panel, their probability-based panel, to sample from a number of different opt-in providers. And so you can see the results on the left are across the 20 benchmark items that they included, and that's at the overall level. And then on the right is among Black and Hispanics, and that's really looking at Black and Hispanics combined. So you can see that the average amount of bias among respondents of color is much larger than the 20 benchmarks at the overall 18+ population. And so what we wanted to do is replicate this, see if we find similar results, but also dig a little bit deeper and break out, separate out Black from Latinx to see if there are differences in the amount of bias that exists within those two groups and how well we're doing with our online samples. Before we do that, we wanted to look at the knowledge panel as a whole. So thinking about our panel, we really work to make sure that it is a bit of a miniature representation of the US. So our recruitment methodology is designed to try to be as representative as possible. But just like any survey, we have some skews in our panel, right? There's differential recruitment and retention rates, and it's typically the same types of people that you would see with any study where it's harder to get them to join the panel in the first place, and then once they're in, stay in the panel. So we do have some demographic misalignments that probably are not of surprise, right? We skew a little bit more female, a little older, a little higher educated, the same types of skews you see in a survey. So we really just wanted to look at the panel overall, unweighted, within race and ethnicity to see how well the panel matches benchmarks. So we were looking at these 8 or 9 demographic items within race and ethnicity at the overall panel level. And so here's what we found. You can see the non-Latinx white divergence from benchmarks was about 3 percentage points. It's a little bit higher among both the Black and Latinx panelists at 5 percentage points. And then those with an other identity is closer to the bias we saw with white panelists at 3%. And then one of the things that we always do with our knowledge panel is that we weight the panel as a whole to census benchmark data. So we were trying to correct for those misalignments. And then what we do is we use that weight in our sample selection so that we're having a probability proportional size. We use the weight as our measure of size to select a sample. And our starting sample then doesn't carry with it those demographic misalignments that exist on the panel as a whole. So we then wanted to see when we apply our typical weight, are we reducing the bias that exists on the unweighted panel? And so we see here that we do. We can see that the bias in each group is now down to 0 to 1 percentage points divergent from benchmarks. And I'll just note here that I do include the other identity, the other racial identity on this slide, because we have quite a large panel at 60,000. But in the rest of the results, we'll be focusing on a survey level estimate. And just due to sample size constraints, I've set that group aside and really focused on white, Black, and Latinx for the rest of the presentation. So as I mentioned, so that's the look at the panel as a whole. Now we really want to see how does a sample, a study that we've executed look. So we designed a study in the fall of last year, and it was similar to the studies that we've looked at before, a benchmarking study where we had a number of items that allowed us to compare to external benchmarks. And we ran it on in parallel on KnowledgePanel, and then 2 different opt-in samples. So the KnowledgePanel sample followed our standard sample selection methodology. I mentioned we weight the panel and then use that weight to select a PPS balanced starting sample. So that's our traditional sampling methodology. And then for the opt-in sample, the way that we go typically about selecting samples in opt-in is a little bit different. So we know with KnowledgePanel, we have a relationship with our panelists. We have them fill out a bunch of demographic information. So we know what their demographics look like ahead of time, and we can use that in our sample selection. And that's not really the case with opt-in sample. Because we're stitching together a sample from different vendors, sometimes it's the intercept sample where you're just catching people as they browse online. You don't have that nice picture of the demographics ahead of time, so you can't really use that as well in your sample selection methodology. So what people do is they typically set up a quota design. And so we were interested in looking at the sample 2 different ways. One with no quotas at all, just see how it looks when it comes to us. and then one with a more traditional typical quota design that you would use in an opt-in study. So we set up quotas by age, gender, race, ethnicity, and education. And then all three of these sample types had about 3,000 completes, some a little more, one a little less. And then what we did was we weighted this data to using a kind of traditional weighting methodology. So we had benchmarks from the 2019 American Community Survey, and we weighted for age by gender, race, ethnicity, education, income, and census region. And I just want to note, so the weighting that we did for race ethnicity was at that overall marginal level. So just making sure that overall our respondent distribution matches the respondent distribution of race ethnicity in the US. We didn't do any nesting within race ethnicity at this point. And so that leads us to the first question. So now that we've done this weighting at the overall level, when we look within our Black and our Latinx respondents, how well are we doing in representing them, even among these basic demographics that we typically use for weighting? So once we apply this overall weight and we look within the subgroups, are they representative? Are they well balanced? So here's how it looks for the Black and African American respondents to the three different sample types. The gray bar is the benchmark from the ACS 2019. The teal bar is the probability-based results, the knowledge panel results, and then the pink purple are the two different opt-in sample types. And then I've just gone ahead and marked in red anywhere that the divergence is 5 percentage points or more from the benchmark. So the first thing you can see is that just like that Jaeger study that we looked at the beginning, the probability-based sample is closer to benchmarks. We do have one place where the knowledge panel was 5 percentage points less than the benchmark. So we're underrepresenting Southern Black African Americans in our results. And then the other thing we see is that the opt-in sample has a much greater divergence from benchmarks. In some cases, pretty large. So if we look at the male and the 18 to 29, we see pretty big difference from benchmarks for both the no quota and the quota design. And here's how that same chart looks like within the Latinx respondents. So you can see the knowledge panel sample again aligns pretty closely with benchmarks and the opt-in sample a bit further off for these weighting demographics. And so then we wanted to look at the benchmarkable items beyond our typical weighting demographics. So in our study, we included 10 items that we might think of as secondary demographics, demographics that we wouldn't use in weighting, like whether or not there's a child under 18 in the household, the number of bedrooms in the household, the number of vehicles in the household, things like that. And we were really conscious when we were picking which items we would compare to the external data, because we were doing this in the context of the pandemic. It was the fall of last year. And so the benchmark items are typically a year or two old that you can compare to. So we wanted to make sure that some of the differences we're seeing aren't necessarily explained by the time difference and the fact that the benchmark would have been done pre-pandemic and our survey was done during pandemic. So we thought these items would be a little bit more robust to those types of temporal differences. And then just like all the other studies, we calculated the average absolute deviation across these 10 measures. And so here's what we found. Just first looking at the overall level, this replicates what Jaeger found 10 years ago. You can see that the knowledge panel sample has the least amount of bias. It's closest to the benchmarks on average, with the opt-in sample having about double the amount of bias. If we look among the white subset of respondents, you can see that the bias for knowledge panel is even a little bit lower at just around 2 percentage points. And then the bias for the opt-in sample is, again, double or more what you see for knowledge panel. And then here's where we start to see the bias increase. So if we're looking among the Black respondents to the sample, we see even the knowledge panel sample now has double the amount of bias that it had for the white respondents. and even larger for the 2 opt-in sample sources. And this is what it looks like among Latinx. So here you can see KnowledgePanel is 5 percentage points different on average from benchmarks, so the highest amount of bias. And the opt-in sample is even higher, and we're now into the double digits in terms of the average amount of divergence from benchmarks on these kind of basic secondary demographic items. So just kind of to summarize what we've seen so far, we do find higher bias among the Black and Latinx subgroups. The divergence from benchmark is larger, and that's true across all the sample types. The typical geodemographic weighting that we do at the overall level doesn't really seem sufficient to align distributions with benchmarks, even among the weighting variables. So even among the traditional variables that we're using, that typical weighting doesn't seem to be enough to reduce bias within Black and Latinx subgroups. And while KnowledgePanel exhibited lower bias than the opt-in sample overall, we do still see that even with the probability-based sample, the bias among Black and Latinx subgroups is larger. And it's largest among the Latinx respondents. So KnowledgePanel is 5 points off from benchmarks, and the opt-in sample was up over 10 percentage points off. And so our next question was, well, can we weight ourselves out of this? What happens if we extend our weighting to adjust within race ethnicity? So we're only doing it at the marginal, but what if we do some nesting? So here's kind of an example comparison of what I mean by extending the weighting. So on the left is the more traditional, where you can see we have age by gender nested, but then all the other variables are typically not nested, right? So race ethnicity would be just on the marginal, education would look the same. And then so in our extended weighting, we're nesting those demographics within race and ethnicity. So you can see that we're now adjusting for Black male 18 to 44, Black female 18 to 44, rather than doing them separately. So did that help us reduce our bias? Not very much. So the picture looks pretty much the same. You can see a little bit of decrease in bias among the Latinx respondents to KnowledgePanel. It's down closer to the bias that we saw for the Black respondents. But again, that's still double what we see for our white respondents on the panel. And the opt-in sample is much higher. So overall, it was reassuring to see how closely the panel as a whole aligned. But the results that we saw even among KP shows that we have room for improvement, right? We're not matching the level of bias within subgroups that we see at the overall level. So if we're just judging the quality of the panel at our general population 18 plus, we think we're doing really well. But we see that we do have some problems when we look within subgroup. And so there are some things that we're thinking about exploring, things that we're working on now. So really reviewing our recruitment methodology to see if there's anything else we can do to bring a more representative set of people in the door in the first place. So we're testing some different postcard designs in our non-response follow-up work and really just rethinking that whole process. We're also looking at differential incentives and reminder protocols. We have a little bit of customization as it is, and it's kind of working to fine tune that to make sure that we're differentially incenting appropriately to recruit and retain people, as well as nudging them with additional reminders to increase completion rates, but doing that in a way that then doesn't annoy them by sending them too many reminders and potentially cause them to leave the panel. And then we're also doing a panel engagement and satisfaction survey. So this is something we do from time to time to really look at how people's experiences are on the panel. But just like with those benchmarking studies, we've really just kind of stopped at the overall level and haven't really dug deeper to look at how those differences might be within race ethnicity. Are there different motivations for joining the panel in the first place, or different levels of satisfaction and reasons for differences in those levels of satisfaction that could help inform our recruitment and our engagement efforts? And then the picture is a little bit different for opt-in sample. We tend to talk about and think about fit for purpose with opt-in, where people, when they move to an opt-in sample, are already accepting a higher level of bias, given the number of studies that have shown that probability-based online sample typically has lower bias. So, if you're moving to an opt-in sample, you might not do that if you really need precise estimates. But I think this work really also sheds some new light on when studies might not be appropriate for opt-in samples. So if your results really are interested in looking at subgroup analyses, particularly within race ethnicity, it might not make sense to run that with an opt-in sample. The amount of bias that you'll have in your results is even higher than you might expect just by looking at that overall level. And then one thing I didn't point out, but you might have seen in each of the bars, is that the no quota design ended up having a lower bias than the opt-in sample with quotas, which was a complete surprise to us and kind of not what you expected. And I would say let's take those results with a grain of salt before we draw any conclusions from it. One thing that you see is that even though you have lower bias with that sample, that does come at the expense of weighting efficiency. So you have to do a lot more weighting to bring that sample in line with the benchmarks. So you have a higher unequal weighting effect there. And then also, as we saw in that first slide, the Jaeger results, where you saw a lot of variability in your opt-in sample. It's possible that this is just an effect of the time that we were in field, the other surveys that were in field that we're competing against for sample. So it's something that we would want to replicate before we draw any conclusions about whether or not quotas or no quotas are reducing bias. And then just like with our probability-based sample, there may be some differential incenting that we could do to help engage a more representative subset of people. And then one other thing that we're considering, so when we extended the weighting to look at the nesting, we were still using kind of the more traditional geodemographic adjustments that you would use in weighting. So one thing that we're thinking about is that maybe some of those secondary demographics that we were using to judge quality might be good for weighting adjustment. And maybe we need to extend our weighting to things like homeownership or marital status to see if that helps us reduce any bias. So that's an abstract that we will be submitting to the April conference today with today's deadline. So stay tuned for that research. And so in general, I think just to sum this up, all of these results show that we do have a lot more work to do in terms of making sure we're really representing people of color in our online samples. And I think we know why it's important for us to make sure that we're fully representing the full diversity of voices here in the US. And then just one last slide to say thank you to a number of people. So one of the cool things about working at Ipsos is that you can see there are a lot of different hands that go into producing any study and executing any study. So just a big thank you to all the people who helped me think about this research, execute this research. I've joined the anti-racism group here at Ipsos, and that's helped me push my thinking in this area. We're working to bring some of this research into that fold. So more cool and exciting stuff coming our way. And so that's it for me today. I thank you so much for listening. I've got my email up here in case you have any questions, but I'm also happy to answer questions now.
Wow, thank you so much, Frances. A tremendous amount of food for thought. It's a great talk. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think we can open this to, we have actually quite a bit of time. I think if you can either put questions into the chat or just unmute and ask. So are there, well, yeah, so are there any questions? And while you're sort of formulating your questions, I did have, well, at least one for Frances. You mentioned that that KnowledgePanel is one of the probability panels that will provide internet access, a device, and I think you know, a plan, a service plan to those who don't have internet access. I'm wondering if how that might be distributed across the different subgroups you were looking at, and if I don't particularly have a hypothesis for how that could be related to the increased bias for Black and Latinx groups, but I'm just wondering if you've looked into that.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I do know that the internet access rates do vary by race and ethnicity. So theoretically, there's a higher need for us to provide internet access to make sure that we're appropriately covering the Black and Latinx community. But I haven't taken that step of looking at the subset of our panel that we supply internet access to see how it relates to some of these measures that we're looking at. And even just at that highest level of looking at, do we have a difference in who we recruit with the internet access, right? So is it true that we're covering more of the Black and Latinx population by providing internet access? That's a really good question to look into.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question. This is Raghu, and sorry, I'm not able to unmute my video. I don't know why it is. The host, it says the host has stopped it. Okay, I'll ask you a question. Did you look at the relationship between your secondary demographics variable that you use, like in your assessment, the 10 of those, and your weight variable, the variables that went into weighting in your opt-in samples and also the knowledge panel samples and the benchmark survey? I wonder the relationship between those 10 variables and your weight variables are quite different across these different samples.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think that might be why we didn't really see a reduction in bias when we did that extended weighting with the nesting, right? So I think thinking about the weighting will only help if it's related to some of the outcome measures of interest, right? And in this case, those outcome measures were those secondary demographics or the benchmarkable items. So I think that may help us, what you're suggesting may help us pick which of those benchmarkable items we might apply to that next paper that we're working on, which is to extend the weighting even further, right? So which one has the most relationship and may then help us reduce bias by extending weighting there.
Have you attempted to examine the impact of these mode differences on the differences in bias with respect to attitudes in the way that you've looked at the impact of mode on demographic characteristics and you know, whether political attitudes or attitudes toward authority and so on?
Yeah, so the trick there is that it's difficult to get benchmarkable items for those measures that would be done around the time that we're doing our studies. So for this study, it was done during the pandemic, and we were really worried, and also with the backdrop of the election, because it was done in September of 2020. So we were worried about looking at some of those attitudinal measures and how we would be comparing to benchmarks that are 1 to 2 years old at that point, because it takes a lot longer for those larger scale surveys to be released. So it's a great point and something that we've kind of tried to figure out how we can make sure that we're having a high quality benchmark to compare to. And I think maybe once we get a little bit further past the pandemic, where that's not affecting some of these measures that we would be interested in, we would like to do that, even though the comparison might be a couple years old at that point.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions? Oh, I see it.
This is Bob Fay, and I'm completely unable to come up with an estimate, but I have a small methodological concern, not with just this specific research, but also the researches that preceded it. And it's simply this, and this is just looking at it as a statistician. A problem of looking at absolute averages of absolute bias, where you have a gold standard and then a smaller survey, is that that measure itself has an upward bias compared to what's in the population. If you had completely large surveys, and there are methods like maybe a design conscious implementation of the jackknife or the bootstrap can actually produce a biased, an estimate of the amount of bias from the sample. And so the natural question is just to eliminate this explanation, which would be an equal explanation why small groups would show more bias than a large group like white non-Hispanic or non-Latinx. Although I've read on the sidelines of this, I've read not every Latinx person enjoys the label right yet.
Yeah, yeah. It's tricky.
That was a side comment, but to return to methodology, there may be some more work to do to eliminate this. And I make no claim to say how much of an effect it will be, but it could be.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point, and something that I will definitely think a bit more about, that some of this might be an artifact of the average absolute deviation that we're using to assess bias.
Thank you. I'll send you an email if we want to continue this further.
That sounds great. Thank you.
There's a question in the chat. I'll read it to you. I was surprised by the finding that the opt-in no quota design led to more bias than the, I guess, opt-in.
Yeah.
It was opt-in with quota, I think, led to more bias than opt-in without. What do you think could be driving the result? I mean, I think you speculated a little bit about this in your final slide, but can you say anything else?
It's really hard to know. And so I do think that it's worth replicating this study to see if we find the same thing. I think there's a real difference in the way that a probability-based panel invites people to a survey. So we'll select a sample for a given study and we'll send an invitation to that specific study. So it's a one-to-one relationship. They click on the invitation, we know what survey they're going into. In the opt-in space, more and more what you see is that people will click on an invitation link, but it's not because there was a survey queued up for them specifically that they're trying to be directed to. Oftentimes they're only matched with the survey at that time of expressing interest in taking a survey. And so based on all of the surveys that are available to the vendor at that time, they'll match the respondent to the survey. Kind of, I think, I don't fully know exactly how that happens, but I think kind of based on the demographic of the person that's coming in and what surveys need different demographics, they're trying to optimize their sample to fill quotas. And so in some ways, your survey is competing with all the other surveys that are in field at that time. And so I think that might explain some of the variability that we see in terms of the results from opt-in sample to opt-in sample. And so it may be that our survey was affected by another survey that had an interest in specific subgroups of interest. So I think there's a lot going on behind the scenes there that could possibly explain that finding. It was extremely surprising to us as well. And then just to say that even though we saw the lower bias, we do have a much higher unequal weighting effect there. So demographically, that sample didn't look as pretty as the sample with quotas.
Other questions? Oh, yeah, Rafael. You're muted still.
Yeah, sorry. Hi, Francis. Thank you for the presentation. Very good. So I was just wondering, like, whether KnowledgePanel, like, what's the like panel maintenance? What do you do in terms of panel maintenance, in terms of like a continuous recruitment, or like sometimes some panels use like panel refresh, right? And like, what do you do exactly to also, if you do anything to deal with like differential attrition, for example? Maybe there might be like some ratio or ethnicity or education groups that are treated at different rates. Like, is there also anything put into consideration, like if you do like, when you do like for the recruitment for the panel, or like panel refresh? Can you say a little bit more about that? Thank you.
Sure, yeah. So as you mentioned, some probability-based panels will do like a once-a-year refreshment for the panel, or maybe twice a year. For a knowledge panel, given that we're trying to maintain a size of 60,000, which is the largest probability-based panel in the US, I believe, although Gallup may be a little bit larger. But given the size of the panel, we're constantly in the field recruiting. So we always have people leaving the panel every day, and then every day we're bringing new people onto the panel. We do slow down recruitment a little bit right around this time of year with the holidays, and then we'll kind of pick it back up again in December. But we're always kind of mailing out new waves of recruitment to bring people onto the panel. So any given study will have a wide mix of tenures. So the panel's been around for 20 years. I haven't looked, I don't know that we have anyone that was from that first wave of recruitment who's been with us for 20 years, but we do have some long tenured folks, and then some folks who have just been in for a couple days. So any given survey will have a mix of different tenures. And it really is kind of a twofold strategy. So we're constantly thinking about how do we evolve our recruitment so that we can have the most representative sample coming in the door. But then, as you mentioned, there's differences in the types of people who will stay on the panel. Some of them only stay for one survey, a couple days, some of them many years. And so we're always trying to figure out ways to keep people engaged longer. Differential incentives is one way that we do that. Most of the attrition from the panel is not people calling us and saying, hey, take me out of this, I don't want to do this anymore. It's people who just kind of stop responding. And so we'll have different levels of when we retire someone from the panel based on so many non-responses. We might, for people, subgroups of interest that are really hard for us to retain, we'll put them on pause for a little bit. And then maybe after a week or two, a month, we'll re-engage them and see if then they start to respond again. Maybe they just needed a break. Whereas other groups where we maybe don't need as many of them, we'll retire them a little bit faster. So there's different strategies that we're using to try to keep people engaged with the panel.
Sounds good, thank you.
Yep.
There's a question in the chat. What are some methods being considered for increasing panel engagement, especially for historically oppressed groups to participate in surveys for organizations whose motives or goals aren't necessarily trusted by those groups?
Yeah, that's one thing that we often think about. I mean, most of our surveys, we don't necessarily reveal the sponsor of the research. It's just a survey that they're taking for KnowledgePanel. Sometimes we do reveal the sponsor. And then we think about that a lot with our recruitment materials as well. So sometimes we think it might be really cool that one of our results was published on 538, but we know that maybe not all of our respondents might think the same thing. So we try to shy away from using maybe some of those polarizing studies in our recruitment materials or in our materials that we'll send to panelists to say, hey, look at this cool thing that you were a part of. We really try to consider the impact that research might have and whether or not everybody will think that was a study that was of value when we're sharing back those results. And so that's one thing. I think the other thing is really differentially not treating everybody as a monolith, right? So looking at what are their motivations for joining the panel, how do they differ across key subgroups, not just by race, ethnicity, but other subgroups as well. To really see if maybe differential incentives might be the thing, or maybe they like sweepstakes, or there's a little game that they can play to spin a wheel to win a prize. So maybe some people prefer that type of engagement. So really looking at what are the different things that people are telling us that they like about the panel. Is it that they like the opportunity to share their voice? Or is it really more that they're in it for the incentives, and trying to make sure we're tailoring our retention efforts to maximize engagement with the panel.
Other questions for Dr. Barlas? Well, not hearing anything else from the audience, I would just like to thank you so much for taking the time to present your invaluable research, and also to give us all the background about the different kinds of ways of reaching online participants. Just terrific. Thank you so much. Keep up the good work. We have a little time remaining, so those of us who also have to get APOR abstracts submitted today have 10 minutes more to work on those. So I really look forward to your talk at APOR in Chicago in May. Anyway, thank you so much. Oh, there's some comment in the chat. Just
a thank you, which I appreciate. Yeah, and
an applause. So let me add to that. So thank you so much. Wonderful talk. And your email address has been posted there for some time, so people can get in touch with you if questions occur to them afterwards. Thanks, and see you in Chicago in the spring.
Sounds good. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much.
It. Yep. Take
Bye,
care.
everyone. Yeah, the recording will be available.